Spoilers ahead for Star Trek Strange New Worlds Episode 7. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Script Department. Today, I have the con alone while Brad continues in his marital bliss, and we continue our ongoing mission to review Strange New Worlds. But before we get going, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, pop over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, various places like that, where you can find all of our podcasts. And as well as that, you can pop over to our website, scriptdepartment.net, where we have all kinds of interesting stuff going on. You should totally go check us out there. We're so fascinating. And if you really like what you hear, you can even consider buying us a coffee. I know, we love coffee over here. So you could have a look down below in the description of the show notes, and then that will give you a link and some information on that one. But let's get to it, because what you're here for is some interesting Star Trek conversations. So let's chat about Star Trek Strange New Worlds Episode 7. And let's be honest, this episode is all about setup. So this episode sets up Angel as a future antagonist, sets up Cyborg, Spock's brother, as a future antagonist, and brings him back into the franchise. It further sets up the relationship potential between Spock and Nurse Chapel, and also discusses further and sets up sort of, I suppose, probably a love triangle with Spock and T'Pring as well. In fact, certainly a love triangle. That's exactly what's going on there. And also continues to sort of explore the idea of Spock's feelings and emotions and things like that. And it feels as though the plot of this episode did somewhat come second to what was going on there and what was going to be set up in the future. And I do feel that it doesn't necessarily work as well as other episodes. So there were some great standout moments of comedy and some interesting character beats. Let's talk about space pirates. Space pirates are great. They're so interesting. They're such a fun thing, but I feel as though they were a bit wasted here. Like, they're mainly used as comic relief, which is no bad thing necessarily, but I do feel as though there could be some greater exploration of the pirate crew on an individual basis, including the big green Irish bearded non-captain fella. He was great. I've got a picture of him just over here, and he was absolutely brilliant. And these pirates are sort of set up to be really formidable, right? And then they do take the ship very quickly. Though I'll come to that. I have a gripe with that, so I'll come to that in a minute. But then we do also see that they are completely disorganized, really easily manipulated. Pike and crew never seem particularly concerned by their adversaries, even when Pike's being punched in the face. In fact, he quite smugly grins his way through most of this episode, to a point where I was almost sort of a little bit put off by that. You know, I did sort of want a little bit of humility from Christopher Pike here, which wasn't forthcoming. And I get, you know, he's the big, brash, confident captain, but a little bit of humility here to recognize his crew's potential peril would have been good. So yeah, and it's an example of us being told one thing but shown something very, very different. In that the pirates are formidable, they're scary, you don't want to be captured by them. Of course, we're being told that by Angel, who subsequently becomes something else. But you know, I don't know. Show us stuff, don't just tell us stuff. And ultimately, my kind of big note on this episode is that I think this should have been 2 parts. It would have been nice to see a lot more of Pike overthrowing that crew. Although we do get that wonderful sequence at the end where he's at the wheel and they're trying to break through, and so I think we did our mutiny a little bit early, a bit prematurely. That was very good. But the whole cooking situation kind of came out of nowhere. It felt quite jarring with the tone of everything else. You know, he's being punched in the face and he manages to get around it by cooking. I know, kind of weird. I think this whole element needed a little bit more time spent on it. And if this had been a 2-part episode, I think maybe you could dig into that situation with the pirate crew a little bit more. The jeopardy of the Enterprise crew, the relationship between Chapel and Spock, and the relationship between Spock and Angel as well. All of these things could be explored in more depth. It's not that I think this was badly paced. I think it was pretty well paced, and it does what it needs to do. I just think the story and the potential of the story deserved a longer exploration. Now, there were some problems with the mechanics of this episode. For starters, how is it, please explain to me, how is it that the Enterprise was not able to communicate with Starfleet on the edge of Federation space. But then when they go into non-Federation space, further away from Starfleet, they are quite able to communicate with Vulcan and T'Pring, and that be in no way an issue whatsoever. That was a little bit of a weird one. For me, I didn't quite grab that. Took me out of it a little bit. And as I mentioned before, the cooking element of this, though funny, was quite jarring. Again, it took me out of it. I do think that the overthrow of the Enterprise, as I mentioned earlier on, overthrow of the Enterprise happened very abruptly with very little resistance from the crew. This seems a bit strange, given Starfleet are known to be very highly trained, and in the face of presumably lesser trained pirates, certainly less disciplined, with less kind of potentially experience in such areas, it did feel like it just sort of happened quite quickly. Yeah, I just feel as though perhaps that could have been drawn out a wee bit more. Again, if it had been 2 parts, that would have been great. But that being said, and with my whole note on the cooking situation, it does occur to me that Pike being able to talk himself out and manipulate his way out of it rather than shooting anything is impressive and does mirror that sort of Gene Roddenberry original optimistic vision of the future, which this series is trying really hard to uphold. And I think that element really works. I just wish we'd gone deeper. But anyway, I'll leave that point alone now, because we can move on from that. Really, this episode's about Spock, right? And his continued exploration of his humanity versus Vulcan's side. Interestingly, Spock hasn't gone through his Kolinahr ceremony yet to purge emotion, which further kind of looks into Ethan Peck's performance. It gives us a huge amount of opportunity to explore that more emotional side of Spock, which, if you're familiar with previous kind of conversations like this, I've mentioned before, I think we're seeing a far more emotional Spock than we did in Nimoy's performance and sort of performances, and even Quinto, I'd say, but on TV we'll keep it to Nimoy. I think, and that's a real compliment. I think it's a really interesting way of looking at that. And if memory serves correctly, Spock doesn't actually undergo this ceremony until after the original series, I believe. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's the case. So we get in Nimoy's performance, when we get to that original series, we see a greater commitment to logic as a way of life. Spock is far more self-assured and far more confident. He's kind of at peace with himself. So presumably, this means that this problem that Spock is currently exploring, the human Vulcan contrast, will be resolved by the end of the Strange New Worlds run, which is really interesting. It's nice to dig into that background of Spock and that kind of deep struggle, which we've seen played out before on in various things, but really dig into it. I think it's really cool. From a writing perspective, this is really interesting as well, the way they're exploring Spock in this series as opposed to the original series, because in that original stuff, the jokes about Spock's Vulcan nature almost come across as a little bit racist. McCoy in particular calls him green-blooded, pointy ears, all this, that, and the other. But here, they're discussing this in a really sort of safe space sort of way. This is an emphasis on exploring that human side. And I think, as Angel says, maybe you're neither. What a great idea, and perhaps that's where his character ends up. Maybe we see that played out in the end, that he is simply Spock. I think that's actually a quote from somewhere. I think he is simply Spock. And I like that as an interesting idea here. I really like the way they've given T'Pring this sort of understanding side and the willingness to explore Spock's half-human side, even if he's not ready to do so yet. I think it'd be really easy for her to be vilified as someone who doesn't respect Spock's other side, and making her the driver of this exploration removes any potential audience problem with her and really makes her a legitimate love interest of Spock beyond the connection he clearly feels with Nurse Chapel. It was a great character beat and something that kind of shows growth in her, and because I was worried that she was going to turn into almost a disapproving wife character, which we don't need. We don't need any of that rubbish in modern television and film. And by kind of having that there, she's making a big effort to understand him and to help him and things like that, which I like. I think that's a nice thing. All of this is great character stuff, and Spock's arc in this episode is done well, and it's very interesting. I just wish the story could have been over 2 episodes. to make the most of the setting. Like, there's something really compelling about the crew of the Enterprise needing to sneak around the ship, and after it's been invaded, the creativity they have to employ to, survive and retake that ship. And we've seen it done on Voyager, on Deep Space Nine, on Enterprise, on Next Generation. In fact, I think every iteration of Star Trek has had this in one way or another. But I honestly think this is probably the least successful way I've seen it done. But simply because I don't think the episode's that interested in it. I don't think it really cares. I think it's all there just to motivate Spock and to introduce these characters that will later be something more. And I'm also along those lines, in terms of introducing people for later, I'm just not that sold on Captain Angel. Like, as I said before, I think it's a setup for her to be an antagonist of the future, but I think there's not enough time for her character to really make her all that formidable. And she's also, from a performance point of view and a writing point of view, probably more writing than performance, actually, when you listen to the lines she's given. It's so scenery chewing, which is not necessarily a bad thing in Star Trek. You look at villains like Khan, for example, the greatest scenery chewer of all time, arguably, very, very theatrical. But I don't think it necessarily works in the same way in this context, because we are looking at something a little more realistic than the original stuff now. I mean, realistic in inverted commas, of course. So I don't know, and I think she was just a little bit rushed, with a bit more time to sit with her. Perhaps that reveal that she is actually the captain of the pirates comes at the end of episode 1 of this two-parter. Maybe it'll be a bit more shocking, because we've had 40 minutes to an hour to get to know her and to see her a little bit more. And yeah, I don't know, I kind of saw that coming a while off. I thought she was a bit too, I don't know, I found that it was a little bit obvious. So a little bit toned back maybe would have worked better. But ultimately, for me, this is probably one of the weaker episodes of the series so far, but it's got so much potential. It's undoubtedly a setup for future stories. So I suppose you could look at this as the first act of a longer story, but if you were going to do that, I wish they'd been more overt about that. Though I suppose they were. I mean, she literally kind of winks down the camera and says, "See you soon." So I don't know, perhaps it is quite overt. But again, I think it just could have been done better over 2 parts and still set up that stuff for future storylines. And as I said, I think it might have made the entire thing just more compelling and given us more to look forward to in the future. Don't know. This is the first time I've come across an episode of Strange New Worlds that I've not immediately clicked with. Although I think if you look back at that, there's a huge amount that is incredibly positive. I think it's just the framing and the setup and a few kind of mechanical things there that don't quite fit for me. But that's okay. That's all right. That, friends, is our review for Star Trek Strange New Worlds episode 7. I hope you enjoyed that. If you agree, disagree, please feel free to voice your opinions below. If you did like it, then you can check us out in various places over the internet. Listen to our previous reviews of Strange New Worlds if you haven't heard them yet. We also have an organized Star Trek playlist on YouTube now, so you can go and listen to Brad and I chatting all things Federation, all things Star Trek, and you can do that right there. It's very exciting. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys, and I will be back next week for more reviews on Star Trek Strange New Worlds. So until then, thanks for coming over. Hope you've enjoyed yourself, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.